Thank you, CE. As you all could tell from Lyle Larson's presentation, he may be from the I-35 corridor down in San Antonio, Bexar County, but he talks like he's from the Panhandle, and he understands agriculture, he understands water, and he's my desk mate, and it's a real privilege to serve with him in the Texas House of Representatives. Lyle, I just want to give you another round of applause. Great job. Thanks for being here. The topic that I was asked to speak on, the interim charges, is, first of all, I just kind of want to get a show of hands. How many of you all know what interim charges actually are? Okay, well, I got a little bit of education to do here, but honestly, what interim charges are issued both by the Lieutenant Governor for the Senate and by the Speaker of the House for the House of Representatives. And what those are, they're directives to the committees in the Texas legislature to spend this interim period of time, 2014, between now and the next session, which kicks off in January 2015, what this time is to be spent focusing upon and where the attention in those committee assignments and work should be directed, and really kind of lays out some priorities. And a lot of folks think, well, that may not be important. They may not do a lot of work with those directives. But I will tell you from personal experience and having sat on the House Natural Resources Committee in the 82nd legislative session, it was the work that was done between the 82nd session and the 83rd session that actually led to House Bill 4 and its passage, which ended up being Prop 6 on the ballot that you all passed in the last election. So interim charges are very important because they direct the public policy debate as we move forward, and they will set the priority and the agenda as we look into the next session. And so what happens now is absolutely critical as to what will be drafted in terms of draft legislation, what will be focused on in the next session, and so that's really important. The Lieutenant Governor issued interim charges to the Senate, a couple of months ago. And so I was hoping that the House would issue its interim charges for House Natural Resources. And fortunately, about 10 days ago, long after this agenda was written and the title of my speech was laid out, the House came out with them. So let's see if I can get this pointer to work. Down there? All right, that's not working, but let's see here. All right, Joe, maybe I need to turn it. There we go. Okay, hold on, let me back up. All right. The interim charges for the Senate and the House, very similar in some respects. The first few here were really kind of issued by the Speaker of the House. He wanted us, the House Committee on Natural Resources, and I don't sit on that committee this term, but Lyle still does, HB 4, which you're all very familiar with, the sustainable long-term financing source for our state's water supply or water plan. We want to make sure that that's being implemented correctly. You're going to hear from Carlos Rubenstein later this afternoon, and I think that with the projects that are being considered and the prioritization of projects across the state, it's going to be very interesting what is funded and how those prioritization techniques are moving forward. And we're going to hear a lot about HB 4. Groundwater, obviously you heard about ASR. You heard about what we're doing with the development of brackish water. Both the House and the Senate had directives for the committees to really look into what we can do, what can be done, analyze the issues, and I think that's obviously something that we'll be focusing on for the next 11 months before the next session. Land and water stewardship, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The charge is to get us comfortable with what we can do with land and water stewardship to further develop our water supply across the state. The oil spill fund use, as you all remember, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. What's happening there is money based on the fines and settlement from BP that is going to be available to the Gulf Coast states. And right now, that number is roughly estimated to be about $627 million. Texas has a share of about 18.4 right now that it can use for projects that are being proposed, and there's public comment period that's going on right now for the use of those projects or the use of those funds to fund those projects. So that's something that will be analyzed by the legislature because there's a long horizon to help the Gulf Coast and the sustainability of the habitats and things that can be done there along the coastal part of our state. Regulatory and permitting, you heard about some of the challenges with permits that Lyle talked about. There's also regulatory effects, both state and federal, on our economy. So the legislature is going to look at what we can do in the water permitting field to really make a difference to our economy. And then finally, legislative oversight. That's kind of a boilerplate type charge, but there has been significant water legislation passed over the past session or two. And so the Speaker and the Lieutenant Governor have asked the committees to really monitor the implementation and oversight of some of these laws. So I think for you to understand where the charges are going to lead us, you have to have a sense of perspective as to where we've been and why those charges were issued. 2011 to 2013 was a very important time, I think, and we'll look back 20 years from now, and I think we'll look at this as a watershed period. When 2011 occurred, we were in session, and so we were in the midst of the worst one-year drought on record. 2012, after we adjourned, we looked back, and the interim committee charges then really were focused largely on the drought and the effects of it. And we learned that there were $7.6 billion of ag losses across the state of Texas. We learned about all the devastating effects. And really the only good news that came out of that one-year drought was that from, the Panhandle to the coast, from far west Texas to the Piney Woods, what you saw was a real agreement, a coalition of folks who have interest in their own backyard for the first time, no matter what part of the state you are from, to do something, to find solutions with respect to the conservation of water, the development of our water supplies, long-term and strategic planning. And the reason is no one was immune. No one was immune from the effects of that drought. So whether you were relying primarily on reservoirs and surface water as your water supply or groundwater for your water supply, no matter what type of water you're relying on, you were affected. And so in the past, where you'd have parts of the state wanting to pass bills affecting certain types of water, it was hard to get everybody to get on board because everybody's region is so diverse and their reliance is so different. So the only good news was there was a silver lining, I guess, in the sense that everybody decided, let's find a solution. And I actually, applaud the Speaker of the House for prioritizing that and making sure that the interim studies after the 82nd session and the work that was done in the 83rd really prioritized water. Surviving the Dust Bowl. Many of you saw Ken Burns' documentary. I think that we're no stranger to conservation and water shortages and how we deal with that in the Texas Panhandle. From the Dust Bowl back in the 30s to the drought of record in the 50s to the drought of 2011, and we're still in drought conditions here presently. We all know that very keenly. Now, other parts of the state aren't the same. But here you can look and see, not only did we have the drought in 2011, but we had devastating wildfires all across the state. The Texas Parks and Wildlife magazine there has the picture of Bastrop fires scorched across, and you see Texas Parks and Wildlife and Texas Department of Agriculture pictures there with respect to what was going on. When you had that high oppressive heat coupled with a lack of rain, it really had a deadly combination for us statewide, as I mentioned, $7.6 billion in ag losses. I always look at this photo, it's Possum Kingdom, for those of you that recognize that. Those were the fires going on back then at that point in time, and it's kind of ironic to have such a large body of water surrounded by these flames that devastated homes and property all around that lake. This was the fire season activity chart at that point in time. It's a little hard to see probably from where you are, but the interesting thing about this is that 81% of the fires across the state of Texas occurred within 2 miles of a community. And so folks were affected not just by the lack of rain, but the conditions and the fuel that was generated by that, along with the oppressive heat and these conditions, really ignited a condition that affected not only millions of acres across the state, but a lot of individuals. And so it wasn't just something that folks in rural communities were dealing with. It was stuff that folks were dealing with all across the state. These are pictures, you saw some earlier from our first speaker of Lake Meredith and Lake Greenbelt and other lakes. This is a photo of the Brazos River, how it's dried up. This was taken just a little over a year ago. The Pedernales River outside Lake Travis on Highway 71. You can see, just the lack of water is devastating. And when you see those time-lapse photography pictures, it's unbelievable how quickly that water is drying up. And as was mentioned earlier, even in the Highland Lakes and Lake Travis, where the evaporation alone just surpassed what was actually taken out of that lake and used, it's pretty dramatic how fast it can go down. So we ended 2011 with all those really tough and horrible conditions on our water supply, and with wildfires, and this was the effect on our public water supply systems across the state. In 2012, you can see the information there. Those were systems that were affected or impacted to a very harmful degree. And some of these communities, there were actually 2 communities in the state of Texas that ran dry. And had to figure out how to truck water into their own communities. And there were dozens of others that were within 180 days of running dry. And so we really found ourselves in dire straits. And the mayor of Groesbeck, Texas came, and I remember her testifying before the House Committee on Natural Resources, really almost in tears, because they were just months away from running out of water, and they had hospital and a prison, and they had, severe needs and demands on their water like so many communities across the state, and were without too many options. So that was the conditions that we were facing really in 2011 and as we entered 2012. And as I mentioned, one of the great things, though, about 2012 was that time was spent between legislative sessions really trying to prioritize what could be done to find a solution. And when I spoke at this symposium in 2012, I can remember, hypothesizing or trying to guess what we would be studying. And a lot of what was suggested at that time was a bottled water tax, a tap fee. There was suggestions that we would put surcharges on electric utility bills to fund our water supply. There was a tremendous amount of effort and desire to find a way to fund our state's water plans so that we can have enough water in the event there was another drought of record. But nobody at that time was talking about ultimately what became HB 4 and Prop 6, which was taking $2 billion out of the state's Economic Stabilization Fund, or the Rainy Day Fund. So often you hear about how revenue drives policy. Well, in this case, it actually did. So during the interim, all of the effects of the drought were studied. It became absolutely crystal clear that something had to be done, and the best result that came out of those studies was to take $2 billion out of the state's Economic Stabilization Fund and use it to create the SWIFT and SWIRF funds that you all approved, and loan that money out at favorable rates for projects all across the state that can be repaid and leveraged in order to finance the state's long-term plans. And so that's what was worked on. HB 4 was drafted during that interim period based on the charges that were given, and we came up with HB 4. Chairman Alan Ritter was the primary author of HB 4. I was privileged to be a joint author along with Reps Johnson, Miller, and Lucio. I got to give credit again to my desk mate, Lyle Larson, because without his leadership, and those of the names you see here and other members of the House Natural Resources Committee, it's doubtful that bill would have passed. But as I mentioned, I think we'll look back 2 decades from now and be so grateful that we have put into place a sustainable source of financing for these projects, whether they be municipal, industrial, the carve out for rural and ag projects, or the 20% for conservation. And Carol, I'm saying conservation, Carol Baker up here with the Texas Water Foundation 2 years ago kind of chastised me because I was talking about low flow toilets and things that other cities were using for conservation efforts. And she says high efficiency. Use the term high efficiency because no one likes to hear low flow. So there you go. I'm saying high efficiency. But But HB4 was really a landmark bill, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done with that, and there's going to be, in all likelihood, some controversy with respect to the prioritization of projects and how that will get funded and you know whose projects will be funded. But the bottom line is we are going to put an infrastructure in place that will help us for years to come. Prop 6 passed with 73.34% in favor. It was interesting, if you kind of look back, or if you like to look at elections and turnout and that sort of data, we had, well, I think it was 1,100,000 voters on this constitutional amendment proposition. Far exceeding what had been the turnout in the previous constitutional ballot election. And so when folks are engaged across the state, and it's not just a regional problem, but when it's a statewide issue that people want to see an issue or a solution to, they turn out. And you can see here very few counties across the state did not vote in favor of Prop 6. Interestingly, I guess some of the wetter counties in East Texas and Central Texas did not favor it, but by and large, the overwhelming majority of the state of Texas did favor Prop 6. The implementation of the bill was voted in, and that is a good thing. Your input is vital to our region in Texas, and why? There are opportunities, not only with the passage of this bill, but through the Texas Water Development Board right now to provide input as to rulemaking and the way projects will be prioritized and what those projects will look like. And absolutely that makes a difference. And they've already held some meetings. Our staff attended one at the Capitol in January. And I've got a slide coming up with a date for the next one in our area, which is in February, later this month in Lubbock. And so I'm going to make sure you all have that information at your fingertips. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor, and interestingly, the left hand of this slide was shown earlier this morning, reflecting kind of the state of Texas and what it looked like in August of 2011. You can see there how desperate we were, and then what it looks like as of last month, January 7th, 2014. Certainly, we are in much better shape than where we were 2-3 years ago, but by no means are we out of the woods, and especially up here in our neck of the woods, we have drought conditions, severe and extreme drought conditions still persisting, and so we're definitely still monitoring that very carefully. This is a slide that really depicts the country, and I find that kind of interesting because we saw earlier today just the state of Texas, but if you look at the entire country, you can see the West Coast is, and those states, those western states are really getting battered just like we were. Even though we're still not out of the woods, they're not either. And so this is not just a Texas issue, it's a regional issue. And as we've discussed some already, I think the interim charges are going to reflect that some of these studies that need to be done and some of these efforts that we're undertaking to cross geopolitical boundaries to find some solutions really will be motivated by, you know, the conditions that exist across state lines. And just as folks from different regions across the state of Texas came together to find a solution, it's conditions like this that make me think, hopefully and optimistically, that folks from other states will also want to find a similar solution to the problems that we're facing, because it is not just a Panhandle problem or a Texas problem. It can be a very significant regional issue as well. This is a side-by-side slide of Lake Travis in 51 and 2011, similar to what you saw with Lake Meredith and Greenbelt and all earlier. I only show this because unless you're driving by these reservoirs or lakes on a daily basis, you really don't always realize how quickly they're evaporating or being used and just not replenished. and it's pretty dramatic. And it's one of those things. If you don't see the bathtub level going down, you don't always know how desperate a situation you're in. But in reservoirs all over the state of Texas, the percentage of their volume is very low. So why is that, and what can we do? Well, and where are we? The House and the Senate both have recognized and prioritized groundwater and the development of additional water, again, through ASR, through brackish groundwater development, through conservation strategies, not just education, but additional conservation strategies. And the reason is Texas continues to grow rapidly. 88% live in metropolitan areas today. We're becoming a very urbanized state. Most of the population is living in metropolitan areas or suburban areas around major metropolitan areas. The I-35 corridor is growing at breakneck speed. And as we're seeing 1,100 citizens or 1,100 individuals move into Texas every day, we have now eclipsed 26 million in population. And that number is expected to grow significantly. State demographers have projected that we will have somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million people by the year 2050. So we're basically going to double our population in the next 40 years. And I thought that sounded dramatic. I looked back and I didn't know if that was an accurate prediction, obviously. So I looked back, and in the 70s, when I was 10 years old, we had 11 million people in the state of Texas. So just since the 70s, we've grown from 11 million to 26 million. So there's absolutely no reason to think that between now and 40 years from now that we won't grow from 26 million to 50, 52, 53 million people. And what that means is not only is there an increased need for us to develop water to meet that demand, with those many businesses being started in Texas, with that many people actually moving here to raise their families, start their businesses, and live here, the demand is growing rapidly. And when you couple that demand with low reservoirs, what does that mean for groundwater? Well, it's getting pumped and pressed and stressed harder than ever. And that is a scary situation. Time magazine, I think that was in 2013, actually had a cover that was reflected here talking about the United States of Texas. It puts every other state in the state of Texas sort of to illustrate that we are a leader. We've got a lot to be proud of, and we have a lot to be very optimistic about. But we also, with that, have to face significant challenges. We're a leader in economics. We have, I think, now become the 12th largest economy if we were a country of our own in the world. We have a $197 billion biennial budget. We have, tremendous natural resources, tremendous capital, great work ethic and environment and climate, tax environment, regulatory environment. It's been very attractive to a lot of people across the country. We've created more jobs in the state of Texas in the last 3 years than all the other states combined. So it's very attractive for folks to move here, but what that does is stress our infrastructure. It stresses the demand on our water supply, and it creates a real issue that, if not addressed with proactive planning now, will create crises in the future. So as I mentioned, the pictures you see here is kind of that suburban sprawl. We're seeing a lot more of the population in the state move into the Austin, San Antonio, Metroplex area, Houston, Corpus Christi. They're widely growing, and the population is spreading out there. They're not moving to the Panhandle. Now, while we might be growing, and some people are clapping about that, by the way. And so while they may be growing that fast, and while we may be growing modestly, what that still means is that there's tremendous pressure on our state's water supply. There is a website, if you ever want to look at it, called Texaplex, www.texaplex.com, and there's a 7-minute video on there. There was one, I think, produced 2-3 years ago, and then there's one that's produced more recently, and it gives facts about this tremendous growth in the state. And it really talks about how, we have incredible resources here, but it's meant more of as a marketing, I guess, piece for folks to actually move here. You know, our governor went across the state and actually was trying to cherry pick businesses out of other states, and I think there was quite a bit of resentment from some of the governors of those states on the receiving end. But in all honesty, there was a lot of facts to back up what was being done to attract folks to this state. But you see a lot of challenges presented with that population growth. We will see it in healthcare, we'll see it in public education, we'll see it with our natural resources, our criminal justice system, we'll see it with our transportation system. Well, that leads me now, really, it's kind of a long-winded way of saying we came out of 2011, severe drought. We went into 12. We looked at what we could do to find some solutions. We went into the session this past January in 13. We passed HB 4 and other legislation that addressed our state's water needs. We found a sustainable source of financing to meet those needs for the next 50 years. Where does that leave us? We cannot be complacent whatsoever, because that financing arm is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to what we need to do. You've already heard about the importance of ASR. You've heard about the importance of developing the 2.7 billion acre feet of brackish water. Not all of that could be used and desalinated for potable purposes, but a lot of it can be. And so you've seen how important it is, based on where we've come, what we've gone through, and what we just accomplished, to really focus our efforts for the upcoming session. So again, this is kind of I'm not going to read all these, but the House and the Senate natural resource charges from both chambers really do focus on groundwater, focuses on HB 4 and its implementation. We want to make sure we're encouraging voluntary protection and stewardship of privately owned lands. And that one's really, I think, important, and I'm glad to see that particular issue make it on to a charge. It wasn't in the Senate's charge, but it was in the House. And there are groups through Texas Parks and Wildlife, conservation easements and trusts that they can establish. The Texas Agricultural Land Trust, TALT, many of you may be familiar with that. If you're not, I would log on to their website and become familiar with it, because for big landowners all across the state who want to find a tax break and might want to maintain their large ranch or farmland without it being fragmented or later developed, conservation easements are a very attractive option for the folks that have that desire. And I think, if we are good stewards of our land and our water supply, that has residual and ripple effects to really create an abundant freshwater supply. And I'm glad to see that will be examined, because I think that really pays some dividends. I don't know if you all remember this, but a couple of years ago in our constitutional amendment election, there was a proposition that would have given a tax incentive, a valuation incentive, to a landowner who met certain standards with regard to water stewardship on his land. It was meant to encourage proper water stewardship. Well, it didn't pass, and I think it failed 53 to 47%. It was a pretty close vote. And one reason I think that it didn't pass was not because anybody thought that was a bad idea, but I think one reason it didn't pass was because it had the words ad valorem taxation in the actual language of the proposition, and it was strangely worded. And so it was kind of hard to read it and really understand what it was. It wasn't really creating a huge, tax break, but what it was doing was providing a tax incentive to somebody that properly managed their farm or ranch land. It was kind of like an ag use exemption. And I think it would have been a good thing. So I would not be at all surprised if something along those lines was further developed in this interim period for consideration in the 84th session, which will kick off next year. As I mentioned earlier, there is a swift implementation timeline. As you all probably well understand, with respect to HB 4 and making that $2 billion available in different ways for different projects, there's public meetings and strategy sessions, and TWDB is having work sessions across the state. The next one is in Lubbock, and my eyesight's not what it used to be, so I'm running over here real quick. I think it's February 24th. They host a work session in Lubbock to solicit public input on the implementation of the SWIFT fund. So I would make note of that. If you have the capability of getting to that meeting or want more details, be sure and look at the Texas Water Development Board's website. Feel free to call my office. I know that that's right around the corner, and it would be really good for any of you that can go and provide public input. I also wanted to mention the Panhandle Regional Water Planning Group has a meeting coming up, and that is, let's see if I can find my notes here. I didn't want to fail to mention that because that also provides an opportunity to provide input with regard to the water planning in this area. That is February 21st at 1:30 on the third floor of the Panhandle Regional Planning Commission. If you have any questions about that, or if you want to attend that meeting and don't have the capability of writing that down right now, feel free to call my office, call the PRPC, call Kyle Ingham, or visit panhandlewater.org. All that information is available to you. So I think that's really a useful thing for us to do, and providing public input is incredibly meaningful. I show this picture of the Bellagio. We talked a little bit about reuse, and when this was developed in Las Vegas, it's crazy to have a water feature kind of like this, and you think it uses all this water, but this water feature was not initially approved. The hotel wanted to figure out a way to do it, so they use gray water. They use water from the showers and bathtubs and what they wash the laundry with, and that's what that water actually is. And they figured out a way to do that without really using a bunch of water out of Las Vegas supply. And I've got this link at the bottom, and what I really like to do with this slide, and I can't do it, our wireless connection in here is, I'm told, is too slow. It would take too long to load this up. But if you click on this link, they've got you've seen those national debt clocks that are just running like crazy, and it shows how much, the $17 trillion in national debt we've got and how it's adding up. They've actually got a clock that runs backwards, and it shows you how quickly Las Vegas is running out of water. And right now, it's a little over 7 years. So it's in days, but it's running backwards. And so even with the aquifer storage efforts that they've got under Lake Mead, if they don't continue to work hard to find ways to develop additional water, that could be a serious problem for them. And so I've always joked that I can't believe the Chamber of Commerce would allow them to do that, because can you imagine having that kind of clock when you're trying to attract visitors to your city or businesses to your city? But apparently they get away with it. Anyway, it's an interesting slide, and it just kind of underscores the importance not only of making sure that as we evaluate the challenges the state is facing regionally and statewide, that we are looking at reuse and recycled water usage. I know that, I've visited water treatment plants in Central Texas and all across the state. I understand that, it's being used more to water parks and golf courses and industrial uses and things that, we really should do more of. And I think the effort is well underway across the state in that regard. I always appreciate the opportunity to visit about water conservation. I always appreciate the opportunity to sort of get material in front of folks across this region with respect to what our office can do and what input we can provide, or what opportunities we might be able to share with you with respect to your ability to provide public comment on how things are being handled at the state level, and especially now with the implementation of HB4 and those funds. We have a real opportunity for the 10% carve out with respect to ag and rural use, and the 20% for conservation. I've heard that those just aren't numbers that are caps. They could be floors. I mean, we need to really make sure that we're doing the right thing, and that's where the public comment period is so critical. So take the opportunity to do that. If you need any more information or would like more information from me with respect to the implementation of those bills, with respect to any of the interim charges that we've covered here or the topical areas, please contact me. My email address is over there at the bottom of this slide. find me here today or my local district office here in Amarillo. More than happy to discuss that with you anytime. At this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you all may have regarding interim charges or anything else we may be doing in the House. Yes, sir. The question is, how do I feel about the groundwater conservation districts in the Panhandle and other conservation districts across the state? Will we be backing them with their efforts to conserve water? And you know, it's yes. I mean, the short answer is I think we've got a good system. There's about 100 roughly conservation districts, groundwater conservation districts across the state of Texas. Some are single county only, and some are multiple counties, and so they look a lot different, you know, one to the next if you're looking at them across the state. But one thing is you know, the element of local control over the water in that region I think is really important. And I think they're doing, especially up here, we have a very solid network of groundwater conservation districts, and I think they do a really good job. I think it's a challenge, you know, and I think permitting and pumping is always going to be, you know, an issue with respect to what's the right balance there. But I have a lot of confidence in their ability to manage that locally in a very productive way. And yes, I think statewide, we've committed to doing that. We've committed to supporting our GCDs, and I believe that we'll see, you know, more support, especially in the areas of conservation and what they're trying to do, you know, in the years to come. You know, the question there is, do I feel metropolitan representatives are trying to take that away from us? I don't really have that impression, but I do have a belief that they don't always understand the issue the way we understand the issue. So whether sometimes you may want to characterize it as trying to take the water or just trying to do something that benefits them and it actually has harmful consequences to us, I think it's more the latter. And I do believe that that education component is key. As was mentioned earlier, you know, if you take West Texas, everything west of I-35, really from Wichita Falls, Vernon, up through the Permian Basin and the Panhandle, there are 16 members in the House of Representatives. There are 25 from Harris County. And so, you know, it really makes a difference for us to be knowledgeable advocates for these issues with our colleagues because, you know, it makes a difference to our own backyard. It makes a difference to our economy. Especially the ag economy in our backyard. 1 out of every 7 jobs in the state of Texas is tied to agriculture, and a lot of that is occurring right up here in the Panhandle. So we need to make sure that we are educating our colleagues. And to be honest, so far, I've been very pleased with the reception we've had on some of these issues. And passing HB 4 will be a big step in the right direction because it will provide some financing where they won't feel the need or the pressure when they're in a crisis stage to come figure out where they can pipe water or take water. And so I think that's really helpful for us in the long run.